Welcome to the UW Now Live. Tonight, we're exploring global hotspots from a rapidly evolving Ebola outbreak in Central Africa to a fragile ceasefire framework between the U.S. and Iran and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Our guests are experts in political science and pathobiological sciences. Mark Copelovitch is a professor of political science and public affairs in the Robert M. La Follette School of Public Affairs at UW-Madison and the director of the UW Center for European Studies. Peter Halfmann is an assistant professor in the Department of Pathobiological Sciences at the UW-Madison School of Veterinary Medicine. A two-time UW-Madison graduate, Peter's research focuses on respiratory viruses and hemorrhagic fever viruses, including Ebola. Finally, Jon Pevehouse is the Mary Herman Rubenstein Professor of Political Science and Public Policy and an expert in international relations and American foreign policy. The conversation will be moderated by your host, Mike Knetter.
Thanks for joining us tonight. You would be forgiven for thinking our show on global hotspots was about Madison, Wisconsin, which is itself a bit of a hotspot today. Probably the heat index is pushing around 100 degrees all day. Something that is apparently happening in many parts of the country. But our show tonight is about the headlines that are unfolding in different parts of the world, but they're all global crises that we think will be reshaping our future. We'll explore the status of the ceasefire with Iran, the current Ebola outbreak in Central Africa, and the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia, and where things stand in that conflict. And along the way, we're going to discuss what these events tell us about health, conflict, diplomacy, and the shifting balance of power around the world. Some of the key questions we hope to answer tonight is, how do public health crises intersect with geopolitical instability? How worried should we be about the Ebola crisis? What does the Iran deal and now non-deal mean for global security and energy markets? And how will that conflict ultimately resolve itself? And how does the war between Russia and Ukraine remain a critical flashpoint even years into the conflict? We'll, of course, ask your questions too, so please put them in the chat in response to our guests' commentary. And we're going to open our show with commentary from each guest. And we're going to start this evening with Jon Pevehouse, who's been a frequent guest on our show. And he's been with us before talking specifically about the Iran conflict. And we've brought him back for an update on how he sees things today. So thanks for joining us, Jon.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Mike. Always a pleasure to be on. So as you said, I'm going to talk about Iran and touch a little bit on the Lebanon situation as well, which is, of course, is intimately linked with the war in Iran. And I'm going to kind of dispense with some of the deeper background facts or issues that have kind of welled up over the years, over the last, frankly, 80 years between the United States and Iran, and really just rewind us about 13 months back to June of 2025, which is the last time we were one of the last times we were talking about this conflict, when Israel and the United States in June of 25 undertook a series of very significant airstrikes against the Iranian nuclear program. And at that time, despite the assertions of the Trump administrations that they had obliterated the Iranian nuclear program, this raised really big concerns about stability in the region, exactly what the geopolitical balance in the region would do if Iran, was sort of on the receiving end of more of these strikes. And it really forced Iran to the negotiating table. And again, there's lots of additional background we could talk about. Happy to, if you have questions about that. But basically, a series of negotiations started through the fall between Iran and the United States about what to do about their nuclear program. In the midst of this, then in December and January, a series of very large-scale protests broke out across Iran. These were economic protests. These were not about any direct, I would say, open political conflict, but really they were economically oriented protests. And over the last 5 to 7 years, Iran has seen some significant protests over time. These, however, seemed larger than normal. And in fact, it was the plunging value of the real, the currency there, which made deepened inflationary crisis, led to more shortages. Some of this caused by the fact that the United States and other countries reimposed sanctions a few years ago on Iran. So in the midst of this sort of domestic economic crisis, you get these large-scale protests. And then in about the second week of January of 2026 of this year, the Iranian government begins a massive and brutal crackdown against these protesters. In the midst of all this, the U.S. and Iran are still trying to negotiate off and on what the future of the nuclear program might look like. A lot of rhetoric starts emerging from the Trump administration. President Trump sort of famously said, help is on the way to the Iranian protesters, that we were going to somehow make changes to the Iranian regime. As these nuclear negotiations are continuing and the protests are being cracked down on and sort of starting to die away, on February 28th of this year, the United States and Israel began a large bombardment of Israel, and in fact killed the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. This was based on some Israeli intelligence where they knew where a lot of the Iranian leadership would be. The hope, I believe, of the United States and of Israel was that this sort of what we would call a decapitation strike would allow the protests to bubble up and take over, and that you would get regime change in Iran. And this was the express purpose of these attacks. There was also a hope that you would degrade the nuclear program and that you would degrade conventional military forces of Iran, which were incredibly strong. Those conventional forces would aid their allies in places like Lebanon with Hezbollah, in places like Yemen with the Houthis, and of course in the Gaza Strip with Hamas. So the hope was that you would accomplish several things: regime change, erode Iran's regional power, and get rid of their nuclear program. So the war goes on. Iran's government does not fall. The regime does not fall. The war kind of drags on, and something interesting happens, which is that Iran discovers that they have a power that they had not exploited before, which is the closing of the Straits of Hormuz, right, which is the major sea lane of communication through which a lot of global oil and gas, about 20%, travel. Now, interestingly, the U.S. did not knew that was a threat, but the U.S. side was not overly concerned. The United States does not rely a lot on this particular source of oil and gas. However, global markets did suffer, and you got massive increases in oil prices, not necessarily because the U.S. was cut off, but because China and India and other countries all of a sudden were lacking a supply of oil, so they began to pay more for it. Up went oil prices, up went gas prices in the United States, which pushes the U.S. economy, already experiencing some inflation, towards higher inflation and towards sort of tougher consumer prices. Fast forward to April, you get the first ceasefire. The Trump administration and Iran declare there's a 2-week ceasefire. It kind of holds, kind of doesn't hold, but the controversial part of this ceasefire was Lebanon, that the United States had essentially agreed for Israel that Israel would cease its war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, which had started March 2nd. So there's some back and forth. That was a shaky ceasefire in Lebanon. Now fast forward to June 17th, and we get what was labeled by some as the final interim ceasefire between all parties, Lebanon and Israel, the United States and Iran. Now, there were violations on the Lebanon side, off and on, but then that kind of gets stabilized. This was signed at Versailles on June 18th. Starting in then the beginning of this month in July, as shipping is increasing, the Straits of Hormuz is declared open. The United States allows Iran to reopen its oil exports. Starting again about the first week of July of this month, there start to be some attacks on ships moving through the Straits of Hormuz by Iran. Iran claims that this ceasefire agreement signed by the United States and the government of Iran gives them the right to control the straits for about 60 days. Now, there's some controversy here. The agreement itself is frankly a little bit vague as to what it says. The exact quote, the exact wording of it in the ceasefire is that the ceasefire allows Iran to, quote, make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels, end quote. So Iran got 60 days to essentially decide what would kind of happen in the strait. Iran attacks these ships because they are leaving the Straits of Hormuz not through the Iranian approved exit method, but they're exiting by Oman. And Iran feared that this would lead to more ships going there and they would lose control. So they attack some ships, The U.S. responds last week by attacking some naval assets in Iran. And obviously things have escalated since then, with President Trump declaring a couple days ago that the ceasefire is now over. So I want to talk a little bit about two things. What are the sticking points? And number two, why is this happening? And then where are we likely to go? So there are four sticking points. Number one are the Straits of Hormuz. And I would just point out to folks watching, again, recall when the war began, this was about regime change. It was about the nuclear program. It was about Iranian proxies. The ceasefire discussions were almost exclusively over the Straits. None of those three things. First of all, Iran's not going to negotiate itself out of power, the current regime. The nuclear program, there was an agreement to discuss it in the future, and that had in fact started to happen with Vice President J.D. Vance. Those talks are now off. And there was really, the discussion of Iranian proxies was all about what was going between Lebanon and Israel. So really the ceasefire became about the Straits. It became about the oil and gas moving through those Straits and who would control that. How long would Iran control it? Could they charge taxes? Could they not? The U.S. position was that they could not. And in fact, that's consistent with international laws, that you cannot charge for transit through international waterways. So of those sticking points, it really has come, this war, which began, I would argue, about three issues, has become about a fourth, which is the Straits. And that's become the major sticking point. I want to talk briefly and kind of end my comments thinking about why does this happen? And I think there are kind of three explanations for why the ceasefire has ended and why you're going to see consistent violence in this area for the foreseeable future. Though, number one, you're reading a lot of criticism about the Trump administration and about the deal, that the ceasefire deal itself was kind of a, quote, bad deal, that it gave too much to Iran. It's been widely criticized in the United States as a giveaway to Iran. People immediately noted the ambiguous wording in parts of the agreement and said that Iran would likely exploit it. Middle East experts worried the Trump administration would exploit it. Trump pledged billions of dollars in economic relief, the lifting of sanctions, unfreezing Iranian funds, providing reconstruction assistance. Now, of course, all of that's off, that the ceasefire is over. In return, really all Iran had to do were two things. It allowed normal commerce to go through the Straits and begin discussion of their nuclear program and the future of the nuclear program. So you might ask yourself, why did this happen? Iran seemed to have a good deal, and people painted this as a good deal for Iran. Why did they then start attacking ships again in the region? Again, I think there's kind of two related issues here. Number one is they found something in this war that they really had not had before. They had never really exploited the Straits as a strategic waterway. And now they figured out that they can do that. They can hold the global economy hostage by using this leverage and using their naval forces. If their view, I'm sure, is that had too much shipping skirted around the southern part of the Straits through and near Oman, this would lessen that leverage. So they wanted to teach shippers a lesson by not allowing them to go through there. Obviously, that's a violation of the spirit of the agreement. At least I think most international lawyers would argue that. They do not see it as such. And so they escalate. But the other thing going on, and this is the second issue, the reason I think this is going to continue and why it broke down, it's just domestic politics in Iran. There are four major groups vying for power in Iran. One group has been completely undermined by this war, and those were kind of the moderate reformists, the people who were protesting. The folks who wanted a more liberal regime in Iran are now either disappeared, in hiding, or in jail. Their argument that the West wasn't hostile to them, that the West would support Iran if they really needed it, if there was regime change, it's hard for them to make a credible case for this. It's hard to know whether they would have won anyway. I don't want to say that was the future, but nonetheless, this group is definitely completely undermined. A second group is what I would call sort of conservative pragmatists in the country. These are folks who tend to be in parliament. They tend to be in the civil service. These are folks who are conservative. They're anti-US, they are anti-Israel, but they also realize they live in a global economy and that to regrow their economy and to recover their military, they have to make deals, right? They have to be practical. Those folks are the ones negotiating right now and trying to get the ceasefire and trying to uphold the ceasefire. The other two groups are very anti-Israeli, anti-US, and are opposed to the ceasefire. And the other two groups are the kind of very conservative clerics and the Republican Guard. right? The Revolutionary Guard, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Right now, they have the top hand, right? And they're the ones pressing the ceasefire. They're the ones who feel like they have the leverage, and they're the ones really trying to come out on top. This war has spurred, ironically, a huge sense of nationalism in Iran. They're taking advantage of that, right? They're using this Iranian nationalism to remain in power, to gain power, and to push aside those moderates or others who would reform to try to keep themselves on top, right? And so the more the war continues, the better justification or excuse they have to keep cracking down, to keep that nationalism going. It was not a surprise to many folks that the attacks on the shipping really escalated with the funeral of the Ayatollah, right? It was a time of great national outpouring of nationalism, religiosity, and the Guard took that chance to escalate and test the ceasefire, which of course failed. The final factor, I think, the reason that's kind of pushing this is simply the U.S. domestic scene. Right now, President Trump and the administration is a little bit caught. He doesn't want to look too weak, right? He doesn't want to look like he's allowing Iran to completely control the straits. Yet, the punishment of the U.S. economy in terms of oil prices by everyday consumers with midterms coming up is an extremely problematic development for the Trump administration. So, he's trying to play this balancing act, which is why, frankly, you see, I think, the Trump administration really going back and forth a lot. We don't care about inflation. We care about inflation. They want peace. They don't want peace. You're seeing a lot of mixed messages and a lot of mixed negotiating strategies because they truly are caught. There's a lot of debate in the administration. Should they really escalate the war and really try to undermine the regime of Iran? Should they just hope that this kind of dies away, right? And that they can get an interim agreement that just allows the shipping to go through, helps the global economy to recover in time for the midterms. The last final quick point I'll make is about Israel. Israel is negotiating with Lebanon over its occupation of southern Lebanon right now with the U.S. We'll see where this goes. Right now, I would say there's not a great chance that these emerge into any kind of stable agreement, again, partly because of Lebanese politics and the elections coming up in Israel. I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you, Jon. That was a very helpful overview of the area and the issues at stake and really how the negotiating points have changed over time. Next, we're going to go to Mark Copelovitch, who is going to talk to us about the situation in Ukraine, more broadly in Russia and Europe, and how all of this is also kind of reshaping the geopolitical landscape. So, Mark, thanks for joining us. Fresh off of your vacation in northern Wisconsin.
Thanks, Mike. Nice to be back on the show. All right. So my task is to talk about the war in Ukraine and what it means. I want to talk about three specific things. So the first is the state of the war. The second is some of the global economic implications and what it means for Europe. Europe's economy, and then the geopolitical developments as well. So let me start with the war. First thing to start is that just sort of a reminder that this war is completely illegal. It is a violation. If you can actually go back to one slide, please. Still a violation of the UN Charter and Ukraine's territorial sovereignty. And there's been devastating human costs for Ukraine. But at the same time, the Vladimir Putin's 3-day special military operation is now in its 5th year. And this war has lasted longer than both World War I and World War II. All right. So the main take on the war side, and you can go to the next slide now, is that Russia really isn't winning. Ukraine isn't losing. Right. This is a shift from where we thought we were a year ago, where Ukraine really was facing soldier shortages and starting to lose territory. And it looked like maybe Russia was slowly gaining the upper hand. That has shifted, especially in the last 6 months. And the main reason why is that Ukraine's drone manufacturing and technology have ramped up massively in the last couple of years now. And, if you can go back to the previous slide, if you notice that basically the lines of the front on the left picture here are the same as where they were in 2022. Right? Russia has had almost 1.5 million casualties and is losing more and more soldiers every week and every month now, and it's not making any gains. And one of the key reasons now is Ukraine has developed the drone capacity to really change the fighting on the ground. And on the right, one of the map you're seeing there, and what you've seen in the news, I think, is Ukraine now has the drone technology to strike Russia's logistics lines militarily in the occupied territories of Ukraine, and also to start targeting Russian oil and military installations on the ground in Russia proper. And that really not only tells us something about the changing balance of power in the war, but also Ukraine really is becoming a proving ground for the future of warfare, right? It is the first war where drone strikes and drone attacks on both sides are really the locus of the technology and the locus of the war fighting. And so that's the state of the war, right? It's not that Ukraine is on the cusp of liberating its territory, but it's also very clear that Russia's advance has been halted. And, we're 4.5 years into what is effectively now a stalemate, but Ukraine is now able to bring the war to Russia proper. Right. And you've probably seen in the news now, they're hitting air defense, they're hitting Moscow, they're hitting oil refineries that are hundreds of miles into Russian territory now. The second thing that I want to talk about is the economic aspect. Right. So the war has been economically disastrous for Ukraine. We are going to need at some point when the war is over something that looks like the Marshall Plan. Right, to rebuild Ukraine economically and rebuild its infrastructure. The International Monetary Fund is providing loans and the international community is providing aid. But the Ukrainian economy is devastated, right, which happens in wartime. On the Russian side, though, Russia's economy is crashing, right? And Russia's ability to Russia has sort of surprised people over the last 4 years, me included, at how it has been able to maintain its economy, even though sanctions have been crippling, right? So the United States and Western democracies, Europe and the G7, since 2022 have increasingly imposed a series of economic sanctions to try and inflict pain on Russia and also to sort of hit them where it hurts in their ability to generate revenue and fight the war. So on the one hand, those have worked, right? You're looking here at a chart of Russian oil and gas revenues and economic sanctions and the oil price cap. The US and the G7 and Europe have basically been able to cut Russian oil and gas revenues by 2/3. And you can see that here. But those sanctions are leaky. Next slide, please. So you can see here, this is Russian oil exports by destination since 2022, that basically the West and Europe and Germany in particular have weaned themselves off of Russian oil and gas. And that has been a huge hit to the Russian economy. But the sanctions are leaky because there are other big countries in the world, in particular India and China. Right. So sanctions aren't airtight. They never were going to be. They have hit the Russian economy hard. The Russian government is running massive debt and deficits. Inflation is very high. But Russia has been able to circumvent the sanctions and trade with the rest of the world. Next slide. What has happened as a result of that is that Russia has become growingly dependent on China in particular. Right, so you're looking at Russian imports by country here, and you can see as we go from 2022 forward, how the US and the EU and other countries really have cut how much they are trading with Russia. And what Russia has done has turned to the countries that will trade with it, both India and China, as export markets for its oil and gas, and China in particular for imports. And we're talking here not just about consumer goods and things, but dual use imports, inputs of production that can be used to build ammunition, to build equipment to help fight the war. That has made the Russian economy increasingly dependent on China. Next slide. That said, the sanctions are not only leaky, in the sense that Russia is able to find willing trading partners like India and China. They have also been able to find willing trading partners with countries in the European Union that are not supposed to be trading with them. Right. So what you're looking at here is a set of charts from Robin Brooks at the Brookings Institution. What these are transshipments of exports to Russia. Right. So the EU has imposed a series of sanctions ratcheted them up about 7 times over the last several years now, that European Union countries like Germany and Italy and Lithuania and Poland are not supposed to be trading with Russia. Right? And if you look at those countries' exports to Russia, they have crashed almost to zero. But at the same time, if you look at charts like this, so this is German exports and Italian exports to Kyrgyzstan, and you would see similar patterns with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and all the other Central Asian republics that used to be part of the Soviet Union. Exports to those countries from EU countries have spiked and stayed high. Right. So unless you believe that there was a sudden boost in demand from Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan for German exports, what that means is that a lot of what Germany sells to the Central Asian republics is finding its way to Russia. Right? So on the one hand, China has helped Russia continue to be able to access materials it needs to fight the war. But at the same time, EU countries have been effectively doing what they shouldn't do and transshipping exports to Russia that have also helped them fight the war. All right, so that's a little bit on the state of the war, which is something of a stalemate, but the balance of power in the last 6 months to a year has started to shift because of drones towards Ukraine. And while Russia has been hit very hard economically by sanctions, there's enough leakage in those sanctions between the EU and China and India that despite its financial difficulties, Russia is still able to keep the war going. What I want to talk about is the third and last thing is the broader geopolitics implications. Like, why does this matter for transatlantic relations, for the U.S. position in the world, for Europe's relations with the U.S. and also with China? So the first thing in that regard is that geopolitically, we're at a very perilous state right now. Right. So 2 big things have happened in terms of U.S. policy towards Ukraine and Europe. One is on the right, which is President Trump and the Trump administration have basically stopped providing aid to Ukraine. So you're looking at a chart here of monthly average aid to Ukraine since 2022. And you can see for the first 3 years of the war, when Joe Biden was president, basically the United States was providing about half of the aid to Ukraine, and European countries, in particular France and Germany, were providing the other half. That's basically turned into all European aid. Right? So there's 2 ways to look at this. One is it's really great news that the European countries, independent of the United States, have stepped up to fill the gap, especially on providing military aid. Ukraine would not be able to fight the war if that had not happened. But on the other hand, it's disastrous for Ukraine that the U.S. has basically stopped supporting them. Right. And the Trump administration's positions in terms of where it stands between Russia and Ukraine and whose side it's on, it's a very different world than it was in 2022 to 2024. Right. The other big geopolitical shift is our relations with our NATO allies. Right. So along with cutting off aid to Ukraine, the other thing that, of course, the Trump administration has done has threatened the territorial integrity of Canada and Denmark. Right. And in particular, in the European context here, Trump is still bringing up, even in the last week or so, this idea that the U.S. should get Greenland. Right. And so transatlantic relations with our NATO allies are at a perilous state right now, because not only does Russia look like a threat to European security, but the United States is starting to look like a threat to European security. And so, if you step back from the Ukraine war and think about what does the state of transatlantic relations look like in U.S. policy towards Europe and Ukraine, it's been a tactical disaster for Ukraine in that Ukraine has now had to find alternative sources of financing and weapons in order to keep fighting the war. But it's also been a strategic disaster for U.S. foreign policy. Right. So the Danes are as anti-United States as you could be right now. They have increased the number of troops that are in Greenland. They and other European allies have floated the idea in simulations of what would we do? We would fight for every inch of NATO. Would we have to defend Greenland against another NATO ally? All right. So threatening Greenland is a direct violation of the NATO treaty, which is that we are all supposed to come to each other's territorial defense. The other thing that's happening is, a massive switch in European public opinion, right, against the United States, and a belief that there's probably no going back, at this point. So not to say that transatlantic relations are over, that American power is over, but the way Europeans are viewing the United States right now is that the world of 1945 to 2024, right, where the transatlantic relationship and NATO was the bedrock of European security, that Europe can't depend on that anymore, right? That we're in a new trust but verify and very transactional world where we'll depend on who the next president is, what the next government is, but that we can't depend on an ironclad guarantee of our security by the Americans anymore. And that is a huge change to world geopolitics, and we can maybe talk about that in Q&A. What I will say in that regard is not only is that a strategic disaster for the United States, but it, in some sense, has been a catalyst, right, for European security. So if you want to look more on the optimistic glasses half full side, nothing mobilizes Europe to come together for economic integration and security cooperation than external threats, right? And Europe now faces two massive external threats. One is military and an active ongoing war to the east from Russia. And the other is, right, the threat of NATO collapsing and losing, the transatlantic relationship and American power and alliance as the bedrock of European security. And so that has catalyzed the Europeans and the Ukrainians to think about, we're going to have to do it ourselves, right? And was a summit this past week, what's called the Coalition of the Willing. So you're looking there at Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, with President Macron of France, Prime Minister Starmer of the UK, and Friedrich Merz. Right. And Europe is now banding together. The Germans are talking about bolstering their security and defense spending to levels that we have not seen ever in the history of the Federal Republic. And the relations between the EU, right, and European NATO countries and Ukraine are starting to become even more and more tight. Right. So I mentioned Ukraine's drone industry and skills in fighting drone warfare now. There are a lot of European leaders. Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, is probably most prominent about this, now talking about how NATO needs Ukraine just as much as Ukraine needs NATO, because the Ukrainian army, right, knows how to fight active wars. And the Ukrainian military industry and drone industry are now being referred to as sort of the front line in the lead arsenal of European security. So in that sense, you can think about Vladimir Putin and to some extent Donald Trump's behaviors are miscalculations. They thought they could drive divisions into Europe and weaken Europe. And really what it's done is it's bolstered European cooperation on security. Next slide, please. Let me just end on an even broader point about the implications of this war. So a lot of discussions in Europe and in Germany in particular now are focused on this idea of, if we can't depend on the Americans, what does Europe's role look like in the world in terms of great power relationships? And a lot of talk, right, from Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, as well as European leaders over the last 6 months or so has been, we need to turn towards China, right? If we're not going to be able to depend on the United States, we need to strengthen ties with China. And I just end by saying that, as much as a threat as Russia is to Europe, and to some extent, Europeans are now viewing the United States as a threat, they don't really want to turn to China because China might even be more of a threat, right? So Der Spiegel just had an article this week. Der Spiegel is the German equivalent of, say, Time Magazine or The Economist in London, that the Russian government and the Chinese government and military are now cooperating deeply, right, on satellite communications, on weapons development, on strategy, on how to fight in Ukraine. So geopolitically, China is a threat as well. And the graph on the right is showing you, why China is also an economic threat, right? So the European economy, Germany in particular, has, like the American economy, been very dependent on relations with China, both exports and imports. And as much as China may now be a geopolitical threat because of its alliance with Russia, it's also an economic threat because of things like electric vehicles and solar panels, right? And so Ukraine is caught in the middle between the US and Russia. Europe is caught in the middle right now, right, in three ways: between Russia militarily, between the US with the tensions in transatlantic relations, And also with China, in that while China might be another pole for Europe to ally with, it also poses an economic and geopolitical threat. Right. So the Russia-Ukraine war is ongoing. The geopolitical and the economic implications are really big for thinking about what the future of the world looks like. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mark. We'll come back to you with questions in a minute, but I want to move quickly to Peter Halfmann, who's been following the Ebola outbreak in Central Africa. And Peter, if we could kind of keep it inside 10 minutes, I want to allow about 15 minutes for some discussion when we're done. Appreciate that.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Mike. So yeah, tonight I want to talk about the 16th and now 17th outbreak of Ebola virus in the DRC, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I want to go technically how this outbreak started, the current status of the outbreak, and then I want to go into the obstacles that the country and the people on the ground have to tackle. So in the next slide, we are looking at 2 emails that came out about suspected cases of Ebola. These are 2 different cases in 2 different areas of the Congo, which is important. And I want everyone to just kind of pay attention to the dates there. So the dates are March 9th and March 10th. This is 2 months before the official outbreak was declared. In the next slide, you see the second email. It's describing suspected cases, and it's giving symptoms like severe headaches, vomiting, and diarrhea. So these are symptoms that could be related to any type of infectious disease in Central Africa. And the problem here is we see these emails come through that there's a potential outbreak, and then we find out it's really not Ebola virus. It's another pathogen, or even like a toxin or a chemical in the environment. As you see in the next slide, it was finally confirmed 2 months later then, on May 16th, that in fact there was an Ebola outbreak going on in Central Africa, in the Congo. This was a man who was from the DRC. He traveled to Uganda, a neighboring country. He presented with symptoms that look like any kind of symptoms of any pathogen in the area. However, his symptoms, or his condition, kind of deteriorated, and what Ebola virus does really well is cause disease. So the virus is going to get into the body. It's going to break down and destroy the cells. Your liver, your spleen, your kidneys kind of fall apart. Your blood vessels fall apart. You start leaking fluids from your vessels. It's hard to maintain blood pressure. An individual that has Ebola virus goes into shock and then multi-organ failure. And that's exactly what happened to this individual. And the important thing here to note is on the bottom here that the causative agent, or the Ebola virus that caused this particular illness, was Bundibugyo. So that's important for several reasons. So then, as the current status of the outbreak in the DRC, the numbers are a day late now. So right now, as of today, we stand with 1,963 cases. That's up 255 cases over a 6-day reporting period. That's about 40 new cases on average a day. The death toll right now stands at 719 cases. Over a 6-day reporting period, that's an increase of 139 cases. That's about an average of 20 cases a day of people dying from this disease. The scale of this outbreak is most likely underreported. The WHO estimates that these figures are probably 2 to 4 times higher. Maybe there's about 7,000 cases. Again, officially this outbreak began in May, but we probably had virus disseminating and spreading back in March. Reasons for the unofficial numbers being higher: you have remote areas of the DRC that don't have the healthcare system that for detection like they should, and a very small portion, but important portion of the country is controlled by rebels. So in the next slide, I think it's important to understand why did we have this 2-month delay here. So when we talk about Ebola virus, you might think of just one virus, but this particular family of viruses divided up into 6 different species or strains shown here. In the next slide, we think about Zaire Ebola virus because this is the virus that has caused so many outbreaks. So Zaire has caused 36 documented outbreaks. 16 of those outbreaks have been in the DRC. And also you see the largest outbreaks are caused by Zaire. The West African outbreak was from 2013 to 2016, had over 30,000 cases with 12,000 deaths. And then only 2 years later, we had the second largest outbreak in Eastern DRC. For 2 years, a total of close to 3,500 cases and over 2,000 deaths. So we're looking at case fatality rates with Zaire being close to 70%. Besides Zaire, we also have Sudan Ebola virus. It's only caused 6 documented outbreaks, with a case fatality, though, fairly high at 50%. And then the next slide, you see some of the wild card or questionable Ebola species or strains. Thai forest Ebola virus. This is found in was found in the Thai forest area of the Ivory Coast. Back in the 1990s, there was 1 outbreak only. It was lethal in a human. And since then, we have never seen Thai forest again. Reston Ebola virus, we've had 5 outbreaks in the United States, 100% lethal, but it was always lethal in non-human primates. These were in monkey quarantine facilities. The first one was in Reston, Virginia, right outside the nation's capital. But the interesting with Reston Ebola virus, it's a cousin of Zaire, but it doesn't cause any lethality in humans. And this Reston Ebola virus was really made famous in Richard Preston's book, The Hot Zone. And then we also have Bombali Ebola virus. This was recently discovered maybe 10 years ago. It's not known to cause infections in humans. We've never had an outbreak of Bombali, but it's found in bats throughout Africa, and these bats live in human dwellings. So it's quite possible this could be another source of a new outbreak. And then the next slide, this is the Ebola virus that is causing the outbreak in Uganda and the DRC. So we've seen Bundibugyo before. Some news media outlets report that this is a new strain, but in fact, we've had 2 previous outbreaks of Bundibugyo in the past. And you see case fatality rates there can range from 25% to 50%. So in the next slide, it's important to know that Ebola virus does not spread by respiratory droplets. So it's not a respiratory virus like influenza virus or SARS-CoV-2 that we experienced in the COVID-19 pandemic. But it does spread through infected bodily fluids. And these bodily fluids are teeming with virus. 100 million, a billion particles in just a mil of fluid that's being excreted from your body, either through vomit, diarrhea, your blood. And then you can imagine your hands. They have cuts, they have microabrasions. So once your hands will touch the virus, it only takes up to maybe 10 virus particles to cause an infection in a human. So even though it's not a respiratory virus, it can spread really easily if you touch the bodily fluids. So in the next slide, the hurdles. Why are we having 40 new cases a day? And why did it take 2 months for us to realize what was going on in the DRC? So like I mentioned, there's 6 different Ebola viruses out there. Zaire caused the most outbreaks. So all of our money, all of our training, all the diagnostic kits, all the protocols in the DRC was to look for Zaire Ebola virus. So those samples in March were tested for Zaire. They came back negative. Sudan was the next likely culprit. And again, they tested for Sudan Ebola virus. And again, the test results came back negative. It wasn't into that May case where the hemorrhagic fever was presented in that person in the Uganda hospital that they decided to test for Bundibugyo virus. And that's when the samples finally came back. But this was 2 months late now. So the virus has been already spreading. So the next slide, another hurdle again is medical countermeasures. Again, we put our money, including the vaccine that I designed for Zaire Ebola virus. The 2 licensed vaccines that are out there are for Zaire Ebola virus. And unfortunately, these viruses are genetically distinct, that a vaccine for Zaire does not protect against Sudan and does not protect against Bundibugyo virus. And unfortunately, there's no vaccines for Sudan and Bundi. One good thing is there have been clinical trials that have started in the DRC. One is a therapeutic antibody, and one's an antiviral remdesivir. But you can see there I listed that the way to give these therapeutics is through IV. And again, the virus is destroying your capillaries, your vessels. So it's really hard to get a needle into a patient that has Ebola virus to try to give a 1 fusion of the antibody or a 10-day course of the antiviral. So you can see how this is a major hurdle. In the next slide, we also have misinformation, distrust, and resistance. Some people in the country believe that Ebola virus is a conspiracy theory, just like some people thought around the world that SARS-CoV-2 was as well. So campaigning to show that Ebola virus is actually real. There's a lot of distrust when a family member goes into one of these Ebola treatment units and does not come back alive. And the other issue is that those family members don't get to see their family member who dies. So there's a lot of distrust that if you go into a hospital or a treatment unit, you're not going to come out and your family's never going to see you again. And this is a real problem. The upside here is that we do see survivors. So survivors are coming out of hospitals, survivors are coming out of these Ebola treatment units and saying, yes, Ebola is real, and I survived, you can come out from this. And then the next slide, contact tracing has been an issue. Trying to identify everyone that a person who was infected came in contact with and could have spread the virus to. Right now, contact tracing is at 78%. The WHO recommends a target of close to 90 to 95% contact tracing. So we're not catching everyone that could potentially be infected. Those who are infected and are giving a contact list are giving less people. Currently in this outbreak, they're listing 10 to 12 people. In previous outbreaks, people have listed 30 to 40 people. So the take-home message here, the virus is way ahead of the response. And recently, there's been 2 cases in the DRC close to the South Sudan border. South Sudan has a very poor health infrastructure. So the virus does cross that border. We're going to be looking at a lot more infections and deaths. And then finally, in the last slide, a final hurdle is there's not enough support or not enough funding. Ebola workers have gone on strike in the DRC. They're not getting paid. And we're not just talking about the doctors and the nurses, the technicians. We're talking about all of those contact tracers, and we're talking about all the logistic people to have a very successful outbreak response. And then, of course, we all know that in the current administration, funding for USAID was really cut. This, of course, hampered the outbreak, but it wouldn't have control of what's going on right now. And then the next slide. Should we be worried in the United States? So during the West African outbreak, we did have 3 infections here in the United States. This was from a person that flew from Liberia to Texas. They infected healthcare workers. Otherwise, no, there's not a big worry except if you work in providing healthcare for the people in the DRC. And then the next slide. I just want to end being a witness to the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone and then the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. It'd be really great. Each time I thought the research community would be a lot more proactive. And as we can see with this particular outbreak in the DRC with Ebola, we're again being really reactive, which is unfortunate. Thanks for your time.
Appreciate that, Peter. I'm going to come back to you right away. You already addressed the fact that it's very unlikely this particular outbreak will make it to the United States. Another viewer kind of wondered, are outbreaks of Ebola almost always going to start in Africa? And if so, why?
Yeah, so that's where the bat that carries the virus is located. But we also see this bat species in China, Australia. We also detect filoviruses like Ebola and Marburg in those countries. Okay. But yeah, typically it should start in Africa.
Okay. I want to go to Mark for a question, or maybe a series of questions. Mark, first of all, Trump and Greenland, is this all just the art of the deal, and we're blowing some bluster here to kind of get the Europeans to snap out of it and take more responsibility for themselves, or what do you make of that?
I used to think that. I think less that than previously. I think people have talked about the Dunrow Doctrine. I think he views the Western Hemisphere in a very 19th century way, as it belongs to the United States and we should have it. On some level, though, it doesn't matter. The Europeans take it deadly seriously, right? In that NATO is a signed, ratified international treaty. There's the Article 5 clause of an attack on one as an attack on everybody. And they very much view this as sort of the ultimate security betrayal, that, we have to take it seriously, that he means it literally. And in that sense, as I was talking about, the response from Europe is now, we can't go back to the same world where we can just depend on American defense and not spend ourselves and not be prepared. And the last time he threatened this a few months ago, the not just the Danes, but other countries in NATO, European countries, were talking about sending troops there. So I do think, right, whether or not Trump means it seriously, and I think most of it is probably for domestic politics, the Europeans take it as a very serious threat.
Thank you. Another follow-up question for you is, do you really, so the EU is somewhat galvanized by the American pullback from Ukraine and just commitments to security generally in the region. But do you think that's going to prove to be stable? Once the US perhaps has truly sort of disengaged and we're not the linchpin of European security, that's going to create a whole new set of dynamics that, while I recognize the first, step or iteration of this might be to bring Europe together, I think there's going to be a lot of other pressures that materialize fairly quickly that could make it difficult for Europe to hang together in this new situation.
Yeah, I mean, the big blockage was Hungary, because a lot of things in Europe have to be done with unanimous consent. And so the election with Hungary was a big turning point, right, in removing Orban. I don't think most of the action is going to be on the EU pushing on common defense. I think it is NATO and the European NATO countries and Canada cooperating without the United States. Right. I think NATO will continue to exist in some form, and European security will continue to happen primarily through NATO, whereas the economic stuff and integration happens primarily through the EU. But there's been a lot of momentum. I mean, the public discussion about Germany in terms of how much you can spend, how much you can go into debt for defense, and how much the German military should be armed, is a night and day 180 shift from where it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. So I think, the French are also talking about, if the US isn't going to do it, we're going to extend the French nuclear umbrella all the way to the Baltic states. And so, plus Sweden and Finland, which were neutral for decades, are now in NATO, right? And so the center of gravity of European security has shifted towards Germany, Finland, Sweden, Poland, and the Baltic states, and less driven by France and the UK. And there's a lot of momentum and public support in those countries because people are scared of Russia, right? So I think you will see a lot of action. I think most of it will be in NATO, though. I don't think you're going to see like an EU army would be the outcome of this. I think that's politically a bridge too far.
Got it. And just to stick with this thread with you, Mark, Peter and Susan Trapp wonder, if Ukraine starts to lose ground, does that embolden Putin to charge on other countries?
So people are worried about this. I think if you asked me a year and a half ago or a year ago, I might have said yes. I think what we've seen is, Russia doesn't know what I was trying to get at with my comments a little bit, is Russia has neither the manpower or military capacity or economic capacity to do that, right? If Ukraine, with effectively drones and outside aid, has been able to fight Russia to a territorial standstill, they're not going to be able to fight Sweden, Poland, and the Baltic states with the help of the rest of Europe to make, I think Putin had eyes on the Baltics. And he thought he was going to be in Kyiv very quickly. And the next thing would be to go to Kaliningrad and the Baltics and whatnot. I think even if he wanted to do that now, that economically and militarily, he wouldn't be able to do it, which isn't to say he wouldn't try in a gambling for resurrection sort of way. But I don't think he'd be able to do it now.
Do you think the weaponization of global financial institutions that the US kind of led against Russia. Do you think that was actually successful here? Because it sounds like Russia's found ways to get around that. And I'm not sure that card ultimately has mattered as much as Ukraine's advances in drone technology.
Yeah, I mean, it worked. You know, I this is sort of how I felt back in 2022, 2023 is it's going to work. And Russia has basically been cut off from global finance. But the world is leaky, right? And it's even more leaky on trade and oil and things like that. So cutting Russia out from the banking system basically meant that they had to turn to China. And cutting them from like European oil markets meant that they basically had to turn from India. So the sanctions worked, and you can weaponize finance. It's just there's a limit. That was never going to be a substitute for military aid. That was never going to be a substitute for totally closing the oil markets and the shadow fleet and things like that. So on the one hand, it's proven that it works. And on the other hand, I think we've seen the limits of that, as you're getting at, that it's not a substitute for the other stuff. And
there's a lot of unintended consequences as well that created new alliances. And, you know, I'm not so sure that proved to be all that effective, I'll just say, in my opinion. But
yeah, and it's strengthened the Russia-Chinese axis in some sense, right? Yep.
Jon, I think you said pretty clearly the moderates in Iran, people who were out protesting, you know, didn't like economic conditions. You think that group has maybe been the biggest loser in what's happened since February?
Absolutely. I think, you know, and would they have lost anyway without the war? Certainly possible. They were obviously undergoing pretty extreme repression in throughout January, yet there were still some protests. And I think now they're the biggest loser, you know. And I think that, you know, you just used the phrase unintended consequence. I mean, it certainly wasn't intended, but it was, I think, foreseeable, you know, like we experienced this in Iraq, right? We knew there was a lot of opposition to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and we thought we'd be greeted as liberators, and we weren't. You know, they shot at us. And obviously there was no ground forces in Iran, but the idea that, you know, just because you don't like your own government, you want some other country to come over and rescue you and put you in power. There's too much nationalism in most countries for that to be very successful. So I do think the war has given the upper hand to the hardliners.
So thinking back to where things were at the beginning of February before the war, this current version of the war really heated up, how has power shifted between Iran, the U.S., Israel, kind of in relative terms, in your opinion, since the start of this conflict in February?
Well, a couple of things. I think Iran has proven far more resilient than a lot of folks thought they would. I think, as I said, they have found a lever that they had not really, they'd thought about exploiting, but they'd never exploited before. And now they know they can. So in that sense, Iran has gained some leverage. The other evidence of that, by the way, is the fact that one of the set of countries really pushing for this ceasefire when it happened were the Gulf monarchies, right? A bunch of countries who don't like Iran and wouldn't have mind seeing regime change and push for regime change. All of a sudden are now like, well, let's take a step back and figure this out. Turns out Iran can hurt us a lot and the entire model. So I think the U.S. has lost, in that sense, the U.S. has lost some power. And I think Israel, it's tough. I mean, I think Israel has really gotten bogged down in Lebanon. This has happened before. This is the same story, different decade. And, you know, I think Israelis don't trust that the Lebanese government can control Hezbollah. I think they're not wrong about that. But I also think the idea of staying in 6 to 8 miles into Lebanon and continually bombing Beirut is not a winning strategy for the Israelis either.
Mark or Jon, this kind of experience with drone warfare that we see both in the Iran war and in the Ukraine war with Russia. I mean, at what point does that become an issue for the United States? I mean, we have a really big country. We have probably the most developed assets and infrastructure that would put us at risk of this kind of thing. When does this reach the United States, and what would we do about it?
I think it could reach sooner than we want. And I think that one of the big issues, then you read about this a lot, is the cost differentials, right? To put up a good screen over such a large territory against drones that cost $2,000-$3,000, cost millions and millions. The cost differential is just insane. And that's the US is currently, I think, working hard and has been working hard for the last decade to solve that cost differential problem. But that's going to be the key. Like you say, we've got a lot of territory to protect, and it's cheap to swarm these things. So
yeah. And I think in the other direction, China is watching what's happening, thinking about, could we invade Taiwan, and realizing it might be a lot harder. And the US is watching and thinking, we used to be able to go in with the world's most powerful military and look at our aircraft carriers and tanks and bombers, and right. If a country can easily ramp up drone production and it's cheap, and you can fight a great power to a standstill, that changes the calculations for us in terms of, what does our military do and how much of an advantage do we have against other countries.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all for giving up your Tuesday evening on a beautiful Wisconsin July summer evening. This has been very informative, very lively chat. I tried to synthesize a lot of the questions and get them to you in a package. And I really appreciate your time and answers tonight. What a great program. Please enjoy the balance of your summer, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
And great to have our audience with us tonight. Fantastic audience take up and sign up, and a lot of people sticking with us through the show. Great to have you with us, and we'll be back again in August. Topic to be determined, but of course, we're closing in on a fall semester and another Badger football season and all that good stuff. So maybe we'll have something to say about that. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your summer, and on Wisconsin.